Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Traci West, Professor Emerite of Christian Ethics and African American Studies at Drew University Theological School. In this episode, we will discuss her scholarship and activism surrounding Black women, gender violence, resistant ethics, and defiant spirituality. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I am just so excited to be here and to be in conversation with you because we have known each other a very long time.
Indeed.
And it's an honor to be on this podcast.
Can you share with us why you have devoted substantial research and time and energy surrounding gender violence?
Yes, I think one of the best ways to answer that is to just tell you the story of when I was serving as a pastor. And I really believe that my interest and my sense of call to do this kind of work academically came from the concrete situation of feeling inadequate as a pastoral leader. For example, I remember someone in my church who had experienced in her family sexual abuse as a teenager. And the whole family was in the congregation. And I can remember the ways in which issues of race and culture and Blackness and the particular ethnic group within Black communities that this family belonged to were part of the messages to be quiet, don't tell anyone, and continue to experience this kind of sexual abuse. And which, of course, combined with the sense that this teenager had, and certainly the parents had, that God and Christianity and what it meant to be a faithful Christian meant that suffering was part of what you needed to do to follow Jesus. And if you were a faithful Christian, you would bear that cross, even as a child. So all of those pieces came together, and I was being asked to intervene and do something about this. And I didn't have training on how to do this. I didn't have resources. And when I went to look for resources, there was a sense of, well, if this is a feminist issue, here are feminist sociology resources about the experiences of women. And I thought, oh, all right, but how is race addressed? And there were just a few phrases that said, but for Black women, it's worse. And that's as much as I could find related to race, when Blackness and race and a sense of racism and the shame of racism was certainly a part of what it meant to be quiet, to be silent. Anyway, so this silo that psychology didn't have anything, the psychological resources didn't talk about faith. The faith resources, there weren't very many, but to the extent that they were, this is only a pastoral care issue. It is not an issue that has to do with the social fabric in which families find themselves. So in so many ways, I experienced this, to be honest, shame about not knowing what to do, being ill-equipped. I knew these dynamics were present, but how are they working together and how do they need to be addressed? And that's just one example. I had many other experiences over and over and over again with people with a range of different cultural and racial backgrounds, and also gender violence. I can remember a student who I went on to do campus ministry, and a gay Black student who was experienced going out with his youth group, which was a predominantly white youth group, and they were out downtown, and some teenagers came in, white teenagers with just disgusting homophobic slurs, and ultimately cornered him, took him outside, and beat him so badly. And the white youth that he was with, they were frightened and they left him by himself. And he was in the hospital, and I spent time visiting him in the hospital. And the messages about Christian faith, again, coming together, the shaming messages about Christian faith, about the violence that he experienced being his fault, the self-blame, all came together with the feeling that there's something that's wrong, but something that was wrong with him. So varying experiences of gender-based violence, including hate violence against people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and queer, became part of how I realized I needed and wanted to do this work.
Was it difficult? Because I remember when The Color Purple was published, that people, of course, had criticism about the portrayal of men in Alice Walker's novel, and also sort of exposing the secrets or dirty laundry of the community in the world.
Yes.
And when you are talking about not only gender violence, but especially violence against Black women or Black men, was it very difficult in those beginning years?
Yes, I think it's still difficult. I have particularly worked on messages within Black communities, particularly Black church communities, but religious communities, including Muslim communities, including Jewish communities. The messages that this is dirty laundry, they're different. So they have a different register, but they work in similar ways to silence. And so absolutely, who wants to feel like you're betraying a community that is already marginalized by talking about the kind of harm and violence that occurs? And how do we find more ways to break that silence? That certainly was difficult then. I can remember being a guest preacher in predominantly Black churches. I have to be careful here because in predominantly white churches as well, pastors will say to me, we don't really have that problem, because I would make it clear, I'm going to say something about gender violence, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual assault. That's just part of what needs to be spoken about when we talk about gospel, particularly liberation. And particularly as a Black feminist, that's just something I do. And invariably, when you're shaking hands with people on the way out, people would come up and whisper, thank you so much for saying that. I am experiencing and some form of gender-based violence. And then I could go back to the pastor and say, you know how you said you don't have this problem? Yeah, you do. And so there are all of these messages to be silent. I like to say, I don't know what you think, but it's important to see them as integrated, the faith messages. And you're, as a theologian, that sometimes we can pull out the theological from the ways in which the community, our broader society, is sending messages related to race, related to gender. And that really doesn't work in people's lived experience. Like, you don't go over here and have a theological experience of understanding the suffering of Jesus. That has nothing to do with your racial background. That has nothing to do with the way you're gendered or your sexual orientation. All of those pieces are part of how you understand yourself and also what gets projected onto you. And so those are all integrated.
That's exactly true. Now, do you think that having the Me Too movement and other movements addressing violence of different kinds, that the situation has been better now, or you think it's not so? We still have a lot of work to do.
I think we still have a lot of work to do. And if anything, I feel like we've drifted back to where we were. So many of our prominent political leaders, like the current president of the United States, are male leaders in the broader state and in other high-profile professional positions who have been not just accused, but in some instances held accountable in court, like the president who has been held in a civil action accountable for his sexual assault. And there is just not a broader sense that's wrong and disqualifying. Not disqualifying from everything he would want to do, but disqualifying for being a leader in a broader public setting. And whether that's church or whether it's government or whether it's in a private industry, there needs to be a sense that certain, particularly unrepentant leaders, and that would be, we have recently had an election close to where I live in New Jersey, but I live very close to New York City. And there was a mayoral election that occurred fairly recently. And one of the candidates, Andrew Cuomo, had to resign in disgrace after many women, I believe it was approximately a dozen women, complained of sexual harassment, and a dozen women's complaints were found credible by the Attorney General. There was an investigation and they were found credible. And yet it was not disqualifying for, I don't know, over 1 million votes for the many people who voted for him and felt very strongly. And he's very unrepentant about his behavior towards women and towards the women who accused him in particular. I don't think we are in a moment where there's been a shift of a sense that certain kinds of non-consensual assaults, harassing behaviors based on gender and sexuality are absolutely not to be tolerated. And when they do occur, there needs to be accountability and consequences for that behavior. I think that is a shift that has not occurred in our culture and in our society.
Yes, indeed. And Traci, you have a very distinguished and long career in the field of Christian ethics. When you look back, can you discern some of the changes in the field, especially when you have Black and Asian, Hispanic, Latino, and other minority groups joining the rank as Christian ethicists?
Yes, a lot has changed. I think that 25 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, there was a very rigid, static sense of representation. And I'm referring to racial inclusion. That there was a sense we need, among liberals, we need to include a Black voice, a Asian voice, a Latina voice, for example. And that was the best one could hope for, whether we're talking about an academic panel or we're talking about an edited volume. You know what I mean? That there was a sense of kind of slots. And I think that the invitation, often when there was that kind of liberal mindset, was that one was expected to represent a monolithic position. What is the Asian American ethicist understanding of this? And that's ridiculous. How large is Asia? What are people from Asian American backgrounds? Like, how many people are we talking about?
So do you think that it has changed?
And
sometimes not much.
Yeah, I think the change that I see is the ways in which some of the newer scholars of color are very organically intersectional in their analysis, in a sense that there doesn't need to be a whole explanation. The perspective that I'm bringing, a womanist perspective, is also going to include a queer studies perspective, or includes a decolonial perspective, or is going to be very much about environmental justice. That's going to be about prison abolition, right? There's an expectation that when someone brings certain kinds of analysis based on questions that come from a womanist or a feminist or a Black feminist or an Asian American feminist perspective, that they are addressing in a thoroughly intersectional way certain kinds of issues in Christian ethics and theology. And you need to understand, well, what's the piece that you're going to argue? Where does that topic land in a broader spectrum a very intersectional understanding of communities. I can find that kind of shift in many more places than I used to be able to. The other thing I want to add, I'm really focusing on race here, and so there's more to say than just race, but is that whiteness used to be an unnamed category. There were these slots for people of color, and then there was regular Christian social ethics. Nobody said that, but that was assumed. That when you said regular, traditional Christian ethics, you're talking about European American, European-based understandings of certain kinds of terms and categories and underlying theologies. There's a question about war, which has this, just war, which has this kind of intellectual genealogy, which primarily is located in European American and European-based thought. But you don't name that, you just name it as the tradition. And I think now, in an increased way, so I'm certainly not saying everywhere in all places, and I'm certainly not even saying dominant. That's not even dominant. But more that you asked me about change, more than used to be the case, white interests, cultural, political interests, the pursuit of those interests, the ways in which those interests are manifested, certainly historically, but currently in present socio-political conditions, get named in a way that they weren't. And you find scholars who are white, not all, of course, and not even most, but increasingly there are more and more who are naming their whiteness and analyzing, right? So not just saying, I'm a white person. That's not what I'm talking about. Let me be really clear about that. I'm talking what kind of analysis of the interests that are present that need to be critically understood and confronted and to some extent dismantled to have a more expansive and in many cases a more just way of understanding who we can be and should be as communities, what kind of wholeness and well-being we're trying to envision and hopefully do more than that, live out. And so I think that shift has occurred to some extent in Christian ethics. What do you think in theology?
I think that likewise, we have had more conversations regarding how race, gender, and sexuality have shaped theological thought, and in what way we have to be more intersectional in our thinking. And certainly the introduction of post-colonial and decolonial thoughts also offers new theoretical tools to look at the past tradition and to critique the present and dreaming about the future. And I like your book, Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, a lot. And towards the end, you talk about hope as a process. Can you say a little bit more? What gives you hope? Why hope is not something you believe in, rather it is a process?
Yes, thank you. I had such a really powerful experience of researching a book where I was able to combine theory and practice, both in my method and hopefully in the storytelling in the final version of the book, where I was able to talk to activist leaders in Ghana, Brazil, and South Africa, and to learn the kinds of strategies, the kinds of problems that they were taking on. So part of my formulation of hope really had to reflect that process. It has to reflect engagement. It has to reflect a process of listening and consciousness of who I am, someone who's engaging in that. And what do I mean by that? I'm a U.S. person. And one of the challenges of international kinds of conversations is there's so much history of U.S. imposition of a sense that people from the U.S. bring the categories and everybody has to fit in those categories that people from the US bring. And so that in combination with I am a Christian and the kind of Christian dominance that exists in the United States, and when those two combine, are so important in the ways in which empire continues to exist and get cultivated around the globe. So what does it mean for me to be conscious? That is part of what I represent, whether I want to or not. I don't want to represent that. But that is, when I go to Ghana, I can talk as much as I want to about how I want to have a mutual exchange about issues of gender violence, because I particularly looked at rape in heterosexual marriage as I talked to leaders trying to pass legislation that would outlaw it. And so I can talk about sort of our mutual struggle. But when they see me, they see a U.S. person. And all of that kind of sense of the Christian imperial U.S. understanding of who the U.S. is in the world is attached to me. And so part of the hope I see is to only in this dialogical, honest, truthful confrontation that is also part of the shared theory practice experience, is there hope for gathering the kinds of tools that we need to dismantle, or at the very least undermine, all of the permission for the varied forms of gender-based violence. Including when I was in South Africa, I talked with Black lesbian leaders who were actively trying to work to end the targeting of Black lesbians for rape and murder because of their lesbian identity. So I was interested in varying kinds of and very localized movements related to gender-based violence in different forms. But again, so many of the conversations included them having to say to me, well, there are U.S. African-American preachers who come here and preach hate against gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender and queer people. So when you sit here and say, I'm a Christian coming from the United States as an African-American Black feminist woman, you need to know that what do you say to those folks who are African-American Christian preachers who are spreading hate and coming with really extensive, well-funded ministries to do that. And the consequences of that hate, literally, we are experiencing in the ways in which we are targeted for brutal forms of gang rapes and in some cases murder. And so that becomes part of the conversation. And I know that doesn't sound very hopeful, right?
When you talk about the American empire, today we see American imperialism even so overtly, and the world can see too. What are you feeling about how the country is going?
What I feel is directly linked to my experience doing my transnational research. One of the things that frustrates me in this moment, there are many, in this moment of this deep investment in American empire and in what is essentially a fascist way of governing, that our current administration is figuring out lots of different ways to, in fact, enact domestically and globally. And one of my frustrations is with how many of us who consider ourselves to be activists on some spectrum of liberal to progressive are caught in feeling surprised. And they're part of that surprise at how fast the kind of fascist policies have been able to be enacted is a sense of U.S. exceptionalism. And is a sense that this is not I can't tell you how many times I've heard it, this is not a third world country, right? this like just dripping with racist, paternalist understanding of the rest of the world, and particularly peoples of the global South, right? That phrase, but this is not a third world country. And I say, wow, okay. So part of the need for solid transnational solidarity is in fact to have this sense of U.S. exceptionalism challenged. And the cost of it is domestic, is the ways in which there's this lack of preparation for what it means to resist and to maintain lots of strategies for that resistance, like a really wide, broad range. Certainly protesting in the streets is important, but that's got to be just one tool. The other piece that's directly related for me is gender violence. So what happens when you have someone who's elected president of the United States who talks so openly and whose lived experience is assaultive of women, and who literally there was a tape of him before he was elected the first time about bragging about how you have to grab women by the blankety blank because they like it. And he was elected only a few weeks after that tape of him saying that. He was elected over Hillary Clinton. So what happens in terms of your moral, cultural compass? There's a shift that occurs, right? There's an acceptance, not only of that kind of talk, but of that behavior. And how do I help us to understand how pivotal putting that lens of anti-gender violence on would help you to see, wow, here is an example of this broad public moral shift in the direction of accepting this dehumanization as a kind of normal activity, predatory male assault of women, and bragging about predatory male assault of women as something as qualifying to be president of the United States. That is a harbinger of this tremendous shift that has only increased in terms of our broader public imagination, and is evidenced in who is the strongest constituency that supports every single thing, every single policy? White Christian evangelicals do not budge. The more the policies become cruel, the withdrawal of USAID global, sending a bag of rice to people, and you've got Christians saying, just cheering on policies of literally starving our neighbors around the globe. When we have the rice, right? The farmers will tell you that it was an important contracts that they were dependent upon. But that's just one example. And then in our current moment, the starving domestically of people who are hungry and dependent upon what's called SNAP, of food stamp resources to help with their groceries. So those are just examples of the role that Christianity also has played in this shift in moral consciousness toward an acceptance of targeting vulnerable peoples. And those vulnerable people, whether it's economically poor, whether it's our trans siblings who are parts of our communities, targeting for the most extreme measures that dehumanize and deny basic human rights and human freedoms.
Given the situation, what would be your advice to the next generation of Christian ethicists or the upcoming generation of activists?
I don't like to give advice. I think for me, I want to ask questions about where current Christian ethicists feel called to intervene, both conceptually, what are the frameworks for understanding our moral life as building a sense of wholeness and well-being that is predicated on really basic notions of equality. So where are you feeling called? And how do you conceptually shift some of the moral frames, whether they're steeped in Christian theological frames, or they could be also steeped in framings of social practices, like the ethics of certain kinds of social practices that occur within religious institutions and beyond. So where are you feeling that call? And then linking that to what are the kinds of institutional practices that those kinds of frame, and every day, I said institutional, I don't mean that. I mean practices within family life, within personal life. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to work on intimate violence, because you have to talk about the most intimate kinds of interactions and the ways in which those interactions can be abusive, and how that abusive behavior and permission for that abusive behavior is linked to these broader conceptual understandings of our faith, of our theology. Anyway, so I'm not recommending that everyone do work on gender-based violence, but I'm just giving you the example of why I think it's so important that you have this practice frame that's always in dialogue with this conceptual frame. And the practices include most personal and intimate, family and institutional and public. Again, because one of the places where I see Christian ethics is an exciting new field is Christian digital ethics. So where public voices are constructing understandings of what is moral and what is immoral, what is good community and what is harmful to community. So I want to be in conversation. I want to ask how you have that theory practice conversation. And then most importantly, who are you partnering with? Because this work, we can't do it alone. Now, that is my advice.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast. It's great to have this conversation with you, Traci. And if you like this episode, please click like, comment, and subscribe so that more people will know about Cock and Roll, this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.